So in this video, let us talk about the difference between entity framework and the repository pattern. Let's find out why both are complementary and not mutually exclusive when you're using one of them. For this, we look at a comparison I prepared here, where we look at one property the repository pattern and entity framework core provide, and how they are complementary or contradictory to each other. The first thing is we want to have a query language, of course, because this is the point of having entity framework or the repository. And in both cases, you can use link with iQueryable, but for entity framework core, this is the only query method. And on the other side, for the repository pattern, you can, of course, implement it in the way you want. Of course, link with iQueryable is pretty much the standard way to query anything in .NET, but there might be things like chaining operators you want for yourself or any other sort of filtering or query language. And you can do this with the repository pattern. And if you have a pretty simple domain, it might even be much easier than that. Then the unit of work we talked about extensively in this section. And for the repository pattern, it's easily extendable for this. We talked about it earlier and we showed it in the examples. For entity framework core, you already have the save changes method, which is an implicit and explicit transaction to the SQL database. So in both cases, this is pretty easy. And if you use the repository pattern as a layer on top of entity framework, you will get this pretty much for free then. The database independence, which is some sort of weak selling factor for the repository or entity framework core, is for the repository, you can fully exchange any database. So if it is a SQL, NoSQL, or even if you are reading from CSV files or anything on the hard drive, it's easy to use because you have a common interface and hide it behind this interface. For entity framework core, not so much because it's only for SQL databases and only for those where a provider is available. And if you use anything like migrations or a code first approach with entity framework core, you will have the problem that not every SQL is the same, and so not every migration is the same. For MySQL or Postgres, for example, you will have different migrations and cannot extend the database easily. If you hide it behind a repository pattern, this might be an option for you still. Caching is easily extendable for the repository. We talked about this. Some of the design patterns here might be a decorator pattern, which can even be extended later on after it's already gone to production. In entity framework core, it is incorporated and can be easily changed and adapted. In entity framework core, you also have something called the change tracking, where you don't have to manage any changes to your database entities, which you are using in your code. So this is something you would have to implement in the repository yourself. But if you're using entity framework core under the hood, you will get this again for free. But as we saw with Dapper in our repository, we can still have this by implementing it in some sort of memory caching layer in the repository. Then the next point is the aggregation of entities. This is one of the main and core benefits of the repository pattern. And this is why we want to use the repository pattern. So we can have a legacy database, for example, or a database that has huge logic inside, and we want only to expose it for our services or our application in a much simplified manner. This is not possible with entity framework core, just for the reason that all the entities have to be mapped to tables of the database. Of course, you can have the navigation properties, which map to the foreign keys, but it is not possible to aggregate entities like you can do with the repository. This is again where they are highly complementary and you can use both of them. And this is why I tend to use them a lot in very complex domains. Then we have standardized access. This is one of the reasons why you would choose the repository in the first place. And for entity framework core, this is sort of built in. The only problem is that you have to repeat all of the queries over and over again, but you can easily change this by having some extension methods or some utility class which encapsulate this, or use the query object pattern. But with the repository, you can't go wrong on this one. Then for testing, I talked about this before, and I'm a huge fan of unit and integration testing for any application. So mocking for unit test is very much the easiest path to take with the repository, because you have a standardized interface, and this interface can easily be mocked with anything like mockq and substitute libraries for .NET Core. Unit tests, on the other hand, for entity framework core can be a little bit harder, but they can be done with in-memory providers, which are, for example, SQLite or the entity framework core in-memory provider. The only problem with this one is that you have no referential integrity. So if you are testing your database code, it might not be as reliable as you might expect. So this is it for the comparison. As a conclusion, you can use Entity Framework Core, of course, in any application that uses a SQL database. And it's often the best idea to do so because it has built in so much of the things we discussed in this section without your rework for this. But on the other hand, the repository pattern is not without value, even though if you're using Entity Framework Core. My suggestion is then to use Entity Framework Core where you see fit. And if there's something more complex, you can still use a repository pattern afterwards. I personally start often with the repository pattern because then I can change the database access technology. Not the database itself, because this is something I seldom do. The database access technology is something I changed during some projects at least. So for example, from Entity Framework Core to Dapper, or you can do this for some implementations only. So where the Entity Framework Core can't help you, for example, with table hierarchies that extensively use inheritance in tables, which is not supported in all cases from Entity Framework Core, you can simply use something like Dapper or ADO.NET. Again, this is some sort of personal preference. My suggestion is starting with Entity Framework Core if you are using it, and then changing to the repository pattern if it becomes apparent that the domain is much more complicated, or even start with the repository pattern if you know that the domain is much more complicated. So this is it for a comparison and my 50 cents to this topic. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.